Most marriages do not end because of one catastrophic moment. They end because of a slow accumulation of patterns that neither person fully understood while they were happening. Small things repeated over months and years that quietly erode the foundation, until one day, both people look at what remains and realize they have been living in the shell of something that stopped working a long time ago. Today, we are going to name 7 of those patterns directly, not to assign blame, not to point fingers at one person or one gender, but because you cannot change what you cannot see, and clarity, even when it is uncomfortable, is always more useful than confusion. Pattern 1. Expecting him to know without being told. This one is so common it has become almost invisible. One person in the relationship has a need. Rather than stating it directly, they wait for their partner to notice, to intuit, to figure it out on their own. When he does not figure it out, the frustration builds, the resentment accumulates, and eventually there is a conflict about something that could have been resolved with a direct conversation weeks ago. The psychology behind this is understandable. People who are emotionally attuned to others often assume that attunement is mutual, that if they would notice something, their partner should notice it too. But men and women process emotional signals differently. Men tend to operate from what has been directly communicated rather than what has been implied. That is not emotional incompetence. It is a different operating system. And 2 different operating systems do not sync automatically. They require deliberate communication. The fix is simpler than most people want to believe. Say what you need, directly, without the accumulated frustration of all the times you felt he should have known. Just say it clearly, as many times as it takes, without resentment. That directness is not unromantic. It is what actually works. Pattern 2. Chronic disrespect delivered in small doses. Disrespect does not always announce itself dramatically. More often it shows up quietly, in the eye roll when he speaks, in the correction delivered in front of other people, in the tone that communicates incompetence before the words even land, in the pattern of dismissing his perspective before he has finished expressing it. None of these individually seems catastrophic, but the accumulation of them does something specific to a man over time. It teaches him that this relationship is not safe for him to be fully present in, that his contributions will be criticized, his opinions dismissed, his efforts judged against a standard he consistently fails to meet. And a man who learns that lesson stops bringing himself fully to the relationship. He disengages not because he stopped caring, but because full engagement stopped being worth the cost. Respect is not a nicety in a long-term relationship. It is structural. Remove it gradually and the structure weakens in ways that are hard to see until the whole thing is already compromised. Pattern 3. Withdrawing intimacy without naming why. For men, physical intimacy is not separate from emotional connection. It is one of the primary ways emotional connection is maintained and expressed. When intimacy is withdrawn, a man does not just feel frustrated physically. He feels rejected personally. He feels the bond weakening in ways that touch something deep in how he experiences the relationship. When intimacy becomes conditional, when it is available only when all the right conditions have been met, when it functions as a reward or is withheld as a consequence, it stops being intimacy and becomes a performance review. And no one sustains genuine emotional investment in a relationship that feels like a performance review they might fail at any given moment. The pattern that follows is predictable. He stops initiating because the repeated experience of rejection is more damaging than the absence of connection. She interprets his withdrawal as disinterest. He interprets her conditions as rejection. Both people feel alone in the relationship without understanding how they got there. Pattern 4. Removing his sense of purpose through constant correction. Men are psychologically built around purpose and contribution, not as a cultural construct that can be updated, as something fundamental to how men experience their own worth in a relationship. A man who feels useful, whose contributions are seen and valued, whose judgment is trusted, that man is invested. He is engaged. He shows up fully. A man who is consistently corrected, whose way of doing things is always slightly wrong, who cannot complete a task without receiving feedback on how it should have been done differently, that man eventually stops trying, not out of laziness, out of a rational response to an environment where effort consistently produces criticism rather than acknowledgement. The irony of this pattern is that it usually produces the exact outcome it was trying to prevent. The more he is corrected, the less he engages. The less he engages, the more she feels she has to manage everything herself. and the more she manages everything herself, the more he withdraws from the roles that were his to begin with. Let him do it his way, even when his way is different from yours. The relationship damage done by chronic correction costs far more than the outcome of any individual task. Pattern 5. Misreading his emotional processing as indifference. Men and women process emotion differently. When something difficult happens, many women process it outwardly, talking through it, expressing it in real time, needing to feel heard in the moment. Many men process it inwardly, compartmentalizing in the moment, and working through the emotional dimension privately and later. When a man stays calm during a crisis, when he moves toward practical solutions rather than emotional expression, many women interpret that calm as evidence that he does not care, does not understand the gravity of what is happening, or is not emotionally present in the relationship. That interpretation is almost always wrong, and the conflict it generates is almost entirely unnecessary. His calm is not indifference. It is how he functions under pressure. It is often one of the most valuable things he brings to the relationship. What helps is simple. When you need him to listen rather than solve, tell him that explicitly. He can do that. But he needs the instruction, because his default is to help through action. Without the instruction, he will keep helping in the only way he knows how, and both of you will keep feeling misunderstood. Pattern 6. Control disguised as care. This pattern is particularly difficult to see from the inside because it does not feel like control. It feels like maintaining standards, like caring about how things are done, like being organized and responsible and thorough. But from his perspective, what it feels like is perpetual management, never being trusted to handle anything without oversight, having his judgment questioned across every domain, being treated not as an equal partner but as someone who requires supervision to function adequately. That dynamic does not produce a more capable, more engaged partner. It produces exactly the opposite. A man who has been managed out of every meaningful role in his own home either rebels or collapses inward, and the woman who created that dynamic through control will then wonder why he is disengaged, why he stopped contributing, why he seems to have given up. Genuine partnership requires genuine trust, and trust requires tolerating the reality that he will sometimes do things differently than you would. That is not a failure of the relationship. That is what partnership between two different people actually looks like. Pattern 7. Comparing reality to a fantasy that never existed. This is the most invisible pattern of all and possibly the most destructive. Every long-term relationship involves the slow collision between expectations and reality. The version of marriage that exists in imagination, shaped by films and social media and romanticized cultural narratives, and the version that exists in daily life with its ordinary friction, its imperfect communication, its routine and compromise and gradual change. When that gap is experienced as a failure, when the distance between the imagined relationship and the actual one is assigned to him as a deficiency he needs to fix, the relationship stops being evaluated on its own terms. It is evaluated against an imaginary standard that no real relationship could ever meet. And the man on the receiving end of that evaluation, who is real and present and trying, who has his own limitations and his own genuine strengths, is constantly found lacking, not because he is actually inadequate, but because the comparison was never fair. The marriages that survive long-term are not the ones that match the fantasy. They are the ones where both people looked honestly at what they actually had, found genuine value in it, and chose to invest in the reality rather than chase the illusion. That choice is always available, but it requires releasing the fantasy first, and that is harder than most people expect. Here is the thread running through all 7 of these patterns. None of them require bad intentions to take hold. Most of them begin with something understandable, a need that was not expressed, a frustration that was not named, an anxiety that found the wrong outlet, a standard that was held a little too tightly. But left unexamined, they compound. And the compounding is what destroys things that could have been saved with earlier awareness. The clearest thing you can do for any relationship you are in is to develop the self-awareness to see your own patterns honestly. Not to be perfect, not to eliminate all friction, but to be the kind of person who can look at their own contribution to a dynamic and adjust it when it is causing damage. That willingness is what separates relationships that grow from relationships that simply deteriorate. At Relation Code, we give you the honest psychological insight to understand relationships at a level that actually changes how you show up in them. No blame, no bitterness, just the clarity that builds something real. If that is the channel you have been looking for, subscribe now and join the community that is choosing growth over resentment every single week. And next on Relation Code, we are going into something that connects directly to everything we covered today. The one thing men stop doing in relationships long before they leave, and why catching it early changes everything. That one is essential viewing. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it.